Hey, Stockholm Community Church, good to be with you once again for this midweek devotion. We're going to jump in here to Philippians chapter 1, 12 through 14 just in a second. But I wanted to quickly have us think about the life of an oyster. Okay, yes, an oyster. What is one of the worst things that could happen to an oyster? Well, in my estimation, for whatever that's worth, it is when a grain of sand makes its way between the mantle of the oyster, which is this protective layer that covers its organs, and the shell. And when a grain of sand makes its way between that mantle and the shell, it causes this oyster pain. It causes this oyster aggravation. And so most of the time, an oyster can identify where that grain of sand is and expel it, but sometimes it's not able to do so. And so it starts to produce this liquid substance that forms layers around that particle of sand. In layer after layer, and year after year, that liquid substance starts to harden. And when it hardens, it forms a pearl, right? That out of the oyster's pain comes something of value, right? This is just such a great illustration for the Christian life, for the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippian church, and for what Paul is going to say in verses 12 through 14 that we're going to dig into, right? But here's this undisputed reality for every single person walking on the face of the earth, every single person who has walked on the face of the earth or will walk on the face of the earth, that every person will encounter pain or suffering at some point in our life, right? Many of us are going through pain points right now. Many of us are experiencing difficulty or some sort of suffering right now. And so the question on the table is does our suffering matter? Right? Does our suffering produce anything? Does our pain produce a pearl? Right? Does those little particles of sand that cause irritation in our lives, do they produce anything at all? And for the Christian, the answer to that question is absolutely, undoubtedly yes, right? That God uses those grains of sand that enter into our life to produce pearls. He uses our suffering to produce value. And so, yes, our suffering matters. And so we talked last week about the Apostle Paul's prayer for this Philippian church, that he desires them to abound more and more in love. And that love was to be coupled with this knowledge of what we've just been calling gospel perspective. And it is that, if we could define gospel perspective as we did last week, it is that the bad things are not always the bad things in the ironic processes of God. Right, that God uses in his ironic process the bad things to produce good. And this is exactly what the Apostle Paul is praying. I want your love to abound more and more with a knowledge of that very thing, of this gospel perspective, your heart to be meshed and fused with your mind. Hey, and so what the Apostle Paul is going to do in 12 through 14 then is actually lay out this example of this gospel perspective of how his situation, his circumstance, his grain of sand that he's has been caught between his mantle and shell is now producing a pearl. Okay, and so let's read here in verses 12 through 14, and then we will pull out a few observations. The Apostle Paul, he writes this: I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. The first observation that I want us to make from this text is that Jesus changes lives. Right? That Jesus transforms lives. Think about this. The Apostle Paul says that he's in prison. You see that in verse 13. right? That his imprisonment is doing something, that it's advancing the gospel. Okay, that the Apostle Paul is in prison, but this is a complete transformation of his life and of his purpose, right? When Jesus met him after Jesus' resurrection on the road to Damascus, where was the Apostle Paul headed? He was headed to get permission to throw followers of Jesus into prison, to persecute them, to beat them, to have them murdered, right? To be handed over to the authorities so that they might be put to death. This is what the Apostle Paul was headed to. This was the purpose of his life, right? He was gaining status, he was gaining stature, he was gaining power, and this was his mission, to throw others in prison. And yet in the ironic process of God, Jesus transformed his life. And now as he writes this letter to this Philippian church, to these Jesus followers, where is he? He's in prison for what? His faith in Jesus. Right? That this gospel perspective that you even see in the life of Paul, right? That Jesus comes to one of the most unlikely people that you would think that Jesus would save, right? An enemy of enemies for Jesus, an enemy of enemies for Jesus's mission, an enemy of enemies for Jesus's church, and yet it pleased Jesus to save Paul. Right? So of all the people who were the most unlikely for Jesus to save, it would have been Paul. Right? And yet Jesus saved him. Jesus changes lives, church. And so I have to ask, like, what in your life needs to be changed? Right? Where in your life do you desire change to be brought about? Here's the question then. Whatever that is, what are you looking to change it? You see, here's the beautiful gospel perspective, that it is only Jesus who's able to save us. It's only Jesus who's able to transform us, to change the purposes in our life. Right? This is just such a beautiful thing. And so how does Jesus change our lives? Well, one, we see that Jesus changes lives by showing himself to us. Right? This is how he saved Paul. This is how he saved the Apostle Paul's life and changed his life. He showed up and showed Paul who he was. Right? That he was not the crucified man, but the crucified and resurrected Savior. That he was God in the flesh, and he showed up to the Apostle Paul, and it radically transformed the Apostle Paul's life. So much so that now he's not wanting to make others suffer for their faith in Jesus. He is actually suffering for his faith in Jesus. And so this, just think about this for a second. We don't suffer for just anything. We suffer for what we find valuable. We suffer for what we find worthy of suffering, right? This is true for athletes. This is true for musicians. This is true for anyone who has a desire to excel in anything. We give ourselves over. We discipline ourselves in such a way to suffer for what we find value in. And this is why the Apostle Paul is so willing to go to prison, so willing to suffer, because he saw the infinite surpassing worth of Jesus Christ. How? Because Jesus transformed his life. He showed him who he was, right? And so I would just, in this, I would just encourage you to think of ways that you can kind of tune your mind into how Jesus has saved you daily, right? How Jesus has transformed your life. And so one of the things that I often do, usually in the morning, my youngest, who's still sleeping in a crib, because if he could sleep in a crib, we're going to keep him in the crib so he can't get out, right? And so usually in the mornings, he calls for my name, right? And as my feet walk towards his crib, I want to constantly remind myself that I could only get out of my crib because Jesus came to me. Right? Jesus sought me out. Right? And so in the same way, like, just what are some markers in your life that you can kind of tune into how Jesus saved you, how Jesus transformed you? Okay, so that's the first observation that I want us to think about, is that Jesus changes lives. The second thing that I want us to see from this text is that the message of Jesus advances in unlikely places. And so look how he said in verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, that the bad things are not always the bad things, the ironic processes of God. Right? That what happened to him was that he's in prison. That's why he names that in verse 13. That has served to advance the gospel. Okay, and so how has it advanced the gospel? Well, it's advanced it by taking the message of Jesus in an unlikely place. Where is that unlikely place? Well, it's being known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest. Okay, I love this because the imperial guard, it was the secret service of sorts that served to protect Caesar, right? Some scholars think this was 9,000 to 10,000 soldiers that just their purpose was to protect and serve Caesar firsthand. Okay, and so Paul's imprisonment is actually made a way for those in the highest ranks to hear this message of the gospel. Like think about this. In fact, in the end of this letter to the Philippian church, Paul is going to say, he's going to greet the Philippian church. He's going to say that there are saints in the household of Caesar, that there were those in Caesar's household, whether that was his family or just those who served the most powerful man in the world at the time, who were saved, who were saints, who had come under the lordship of Jesus. They were not recognizing Caesar as Lord, but rather Jesus as Lord. And so how did that happen? It happened by the Apostle Paul's imprisonment. And so how does this gospel perspective shape this verse? Well, if we think about this, Paul, when he got saved, he was rising in status, right? This is what we talked about. But his conversion to Christianity, his following of Jesus, made him lose all of that, right? He says in this letter that he counts all of that as loss, right? That all of those things as loss. And so he went from a high status to a low status. So low of the status that he finds himself in prison. Paul's low status as a slave and as a prisoner for Christ has actually allowed the gospel to invade the highest places in the land. Right? That this is this gospel perspective, that it wasn't in Paul's highest rank that the message of God was going forward. It was actually in his lowest rank where the message invaded the highest places in the land. Right? And so here's this beautiful reality. Not only does Jesus change lives, but Jesus uses lives. Right? Jesus uses lives. He uses this sand point for Paul, right, to produce this good news, to invade and give hope into places where they're finding false hope. Okay, and so then the third thing that I want us to see from this text is that the message of Jesus emboldens individuals. You see that in verse 14. He says this, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So if the first thing that the gospel or Paul's imprisonment did to advance the gospel was to take it to the highest ranks in the land, then the second thing that it was doing was actually emboldening believers, right? If his imprisonment was saving unbelievers, was going to save unbelievers, it was actually edifying and encouraging and emboldening believers in Rome. This is what he's saying in verse 14, right? And so prison is not meant to embolden others. It's actually meant to be a deterrent, right? But here, once again, you get this gospel perspective where Paul's imprisonment is actually emboldening them, right? It's making them more courageous. It's making them more bold to share the word of God. Okay, and so what you see is Paul's pain is actually bringing about a pearl. It is bringing about this glorious value going forward, that people are coming into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so why does it matter that the gospel is advancing? Okay, why does it matter that the gospel is advancing? Well, one, it shows us that Jesus really is who he said he was, that he really was God in the flesh. Right? So if you think about this, what happened to the disciples after Jesus was crucified? They were not emboldened. They were actually extremely fearful. Right? But how did they become emboldened? How did these believers in that Paul's talking about in Rome become more bold, more courageous, more confident in the Lord? Well, they knew that Jesus didn't stay in the grave, but he rose from the dead. And so once again, this gospel perspective brings us back to see that even the crucifixion of Jesus brought about a glorious resurrection where Jesus is king over all, that he has the name above all names, the name in which every knee should bow. And so, Christian, for you to ponder, maybe one of the things that would be really helpful for you to do in the coming days is just to write down all of those points of sand that have worked their way between your mantle and your shell, right? All those pain marks in your life, all the suffering that you've went through, all the suffering that you're currently going through. And then you would write all those things down, and then you would take a marker and you would write over it in bold letters that God is at work. This is what we see in verses 12 through 14, that the bad things are not always the bad things in the ironic processes of God. This is what our God does, that he makes pearls out of sand. Okay, church, I hope that this message finds you well. I am praying for you as always. Once again, let me know if there's anything that you need. We will see you later.